Hello! Today we're going to talk about Prior Written Notice, or PWN. After this training, you should be able to understand and incorporate different types of proposals to be recorded in an IEP's PWN, or Prior Written Notice. Recognize and utilize appropriate language for a PWN. Identify resources to go to for help. And to understand Santa Fe Public Schools' expectations when writing a PWN. One question that often comes up is who gets to actually make proposals in a prior written notice. It can be one of two groups. The first group is a local education agency, such as Santa Fe Public Schools. Case managers, occupational therapists, principals, general ed teachers are all examples of people who work for Santa Fe Public Schools or the local education agency. The second group is the parent or the student. Now that we know who gets to make the proposals in a prior written notice in an IEP, we need to talk about what kind of proposals do we put in a prior written notice. You will need to include any proposals that will start or change, identification, evaluation, educational placement of the student, including any refusal to make those changes. You are also going to want to add in any proposals that are going to initiate or change FAPE. FAPE means Free and Appropriate Public Education. You might be wondering what else goes in a prior written notice. You also need to include a statement that the parents of a child with a disability have protection under the procedural safeguards and how parents can obtain a copy of them. Additionally, you're going to want to include sources for parents to contact to obtain assistance in understanding these provisions. So we've talked a lot about what goes in a prior written notice, but let's delve a little bit deeper and talk a bit more about what those mean. So when we're talking about identification, we're talking about identification as a student with a disability, such as specific learning disability, autism, developmental delay, speech-language impairment, emotional disturbance, intellectually disabled, deaf-blindness, multiple disabilities, traumatic brain injury, visual impairments including blindness, gifted, and orthopedic impairment. It's not uncommon to have a lot of questions about writing a prior written notice, so let's go over some of the more common ones. This is one that I've heard quite often. Do I have to PWN if the IEP determines that the student no longer meets eligibility requirements for one or more of the categories? Now would be a good time to stop the video. If you're watching this with another person, go ahead and spend some time talking about this question. Okay, we're back, and the answer is yes. If a student is no longer identified as a student with a particular disability in a category, then that is a change that we must include in the prior written notice. Let's go ahead and talk about another common question. This one can actually be quite tricky, but the question is, do I have to PWN if the IEP team decides the student does not meet eligibility requirements for a particular category? This would be a good time to stop the video. If you're working with somebody else, go ahead and turn to them and discuss. And the answer is yes. If that eligibility category has been proposed, but after analyzing reports and data, the IEP team decides that that student does not meet eligibility requirements, you still need to PWN the fact that that child does not meet eligibility requirements for that particular category. Please keep in mind, though, that you do not have to write in the PWN every single eligibility category, just the ones that have been proposed. So let's look at another frequently asked question. If dyslexia is proposed, do I need to include the acceptance of or the rejection of that in the prior written notice? Now would be a good time to turn the video off and to discuss this with a partner. And the answer is, if dyslexia has been proposed, you do need to include it in the prior written notice, and you will need to include whatever data and report that you use to determine your decision. Whether or not that student should be classified as a student who has dyslexia on their IEP. Okay, now that we've talked about identification in the prior written notice, let's talk a little bit about evaluation. We're going to talk about examples of proposals for evaluation. Parents must receive a prior written notice for any initial evaluation. Now, an initial evaluation is for students who are not already in special education. You will also want to include a prior written notice any particular assessment, like something for occupational therapy or social work. If you want to collect more data. If you're determining eligibility based on data. If you plan on gathering additional data, such as with an FBA or with diagnostic testing. If you're determining continued eligibility after students are already in special education. If you're talking about exit from special education. Let's go to some frequently asked questions about evaluation in prior written notice. One common question is, do I have to PWN assessments like the PARC or DEA or DIBELS? Now would be a good time to pause the video, and if you're working with someone else, go ahead and ask them what they think. We are back, and the answer is, generally not. If it is the practice for the student's general education peers to take the evaluation, then there is no need to include it in a prior written notice. Let's go ahead and look at another frequently asked question. So do I have to prior written notice if the student is going to take the NMAA, the New Mexico Alternate Assessment? Now is a good time to pause the video. If you're working with a partner, go ahead and ask them what they're thinking. We're back, and the answer is yes. Since a general education student will not be taking the New Mexico Alternate Assessment, and only a special education student would be, that is a decision by the IEP team that does need to be included in the prior written notice. Okay, now that we've talked about evaluation and gone through some frequently asked questions, let's go ahead and talk about educational placement in the prior written notice. Educational placement talks about where a student with a disability receives his or her special education and related services. They receive services in either the general education setting, the special education setting. Keep in mind, it could also include a different school, like ZIA, an ICE placement, which stands for Interim Alternative Education Setting, or when a student is suspended for more than 10 days in a row. Usually this happens with a manifestation hearing. So now that we know more about educational placement, let's go to some frequently asked questions. So one frequently asked question is, do I need to include in a prior written notice when a student moves from Mr. X's general education class to Mrs. Y's general education classroom? Now would be a good time to pause the video, and if you're working with a partner, go ahead and ask them what they think. We're back, and the answer is generally not. As long as the services are the same, and both classrooms are in the general education setting, this is not an IEP team decision requiring a prior written notice, but It's nice to give parents a heads up anyway, just like what you would do with a general education student. It just doesn't rise to the level where you would need a prior written notice for this. Let's look at another frequently asked question. Do I need to PWN when a student moves from Mr. X's special education class to Mrs. Y's general education classroom? Let's go ahead and turn off the video now. And if we are working with a partner, let's turn to them and ask them what they think. And we're back. And the answer is yes. The student setting is no longer in the special education setting. It is now in the general education setting. And that means that you have to include that change in the prior written notice. Okay, so now we've talked about identification and evaluation. Let's go in a little bit deeper and talk a little bit more about FAPE. The F in FAPE stands for free. Free means that all eligible students with disabilities will be educated at public expense with no cost to the parent. Parents still do have to cover some incidental fees that are the same for all general education students. The A in FAPE stands for appropriate. Now, appropriate means that the student with a disability is entitled to an education that is appropriate to her. It will be tailored and planned to meet her needs as stated in the IEP. The P in FAPE stands for public. Public refers to the public school system. Children with disabilities, whatever their nature or severity of their disabilities, have the right to be educated under public supervision. The E in FAPE stands for education. Education must be provided to every eligible school-age student with a disability. FAPE ensures that this student will receive a public education that includes the services outlined in their IEP. So now that you have a good overview of FAPE, let's really drill down and see what FAPE means in an IEP and what it has to do with the prior written notice. So goals, services, duration of those services are all things that constitute FAPE in an IEP. You would want to PWN if a student had a BIP, or if they had accommodations or modifications. You would also want to include in the prior written notice if they were taking the alternative assessment, if they needed any particular assistive technology, or if they needed ESY, extended school year. For students on a secondary IEP, you'd want to include their graduation pathway. You would also include special transportation if the student was eligible, and course of study, especially if the student is on the ability or career pathway. Post-secondary goals and transition planning, as well as age of majority for students who are 14 or older. You would also want to include exits, health plans, adapted PE, emergency evacuation plans. A really common question is, what FAPE proposal should always be in the prior written notice? Should I always put transportation? Should I always put extended school year? And the answer is, since no IEP is identical, then no prior written notice will be identical either. What you want to remember for FAPE is, you have to provide a prior written notice when something starts, when it changes, if it is proposed by the parent or the student, if it is proposed and the district is rejecting the proposal. Okay, now that we know a little bit more about FAPE, let's go into some frequently asked questions. You have a student. This student has a visual impairment. On the special factors section, the district proposes teaching Braille and instructing in Braille. Do you include this proposal in the prior written notice? Let's go ahead and stop the video now, and if you're working with a partner, turn to them and see what they think. We're back, and the answer is yes. For this student, the initiation of using Braille is part of the student's FAPE, so you would include it in the prior written notice. So let's go ahead and look at another scenario. For this scenario, it doesn't really matter what eligibility area the student has. We just want to say that they don't have a visual impairment. On the Special Factors section, the district checks no to visual impairment, teaching in Braille, and instructing in Braille. So the question is, would you consider this a proposal and write it in the prior written notice? Go ahead and pause the video now and talk it over with a partner. And the answer is no. You might be wondering why though. And the answer is, the district is not proposing Braille, and the student does not have a need for Braille, and the student never needed or used Braille in the past, and the parents are proposing Braille now, then you would not need to include it in the prior written notice. Okay, let's go ahead and look at another scenario. For scenario 3, let's say student X, who has an eligibility of autism, has made growth on their goals. The student's goals in OT, reading, PT, and math have changed. Do you capture this in the prior written notice? Go ahead and pause the video now as you discuss your answer. And the answer is yes. Goals are a part of FAPE, and we want to make sure we capture that in the prior written notice. Okay, we're going to go ahead and look at another scenario. For scenario 4, we have a student who has an eligibility of autism. For this scenario, the eligibility doesn't matter that much. What does matter is the student's goals in OT, reading, PT, and math have not changed. Do you capture this information in a prior written notice? Well, the answer to that is kind of tricky. Go ahead and pause the video now to talk it over. Why is this question so tricky? Earlier in the presentation, we talked about how in the prior written notice you need to capture anything that starts or changes, especially with FAPE. Well, goals are a part of FAPE, and goals are designed to be achievable within 1 calendar year. When goals are not achieved in the timeline, that presents a problem for IEP teams, a problem they need to address. So for this scenario, let's say this was an annual IEP and not a revision. So you would either need to rewrite the goal so it would be achievable within the timeline, or you might address what you're going to do differently so that the student could meet the goal. And this could mean accommodation changes, setting changes, or service changes. All right then, let's go ahead and look at another scenario. For the next scenario, let's say that a student has just been identified as a student with a disability as part of the EDT process. So the question is, do you need to capture in the prior written notice the need for specially designed instruction or special education? Go ahead and pause the video now and talk about it with a partner. And the answer is yes. And you might be wondering why. It's because the identification of and need for special education services are 2 different things. For example, a student could have a disability, and that disability may not have the impact needed to require special education to access the general curriculum. So a student may be identified as having a disability, but they actually don't need special education, and that's what makes it 2 different things. So we've talked a lot about what types of proposals do we need to capture in a prior written notice, but what is equally important is the language, and that's what we're going to cover next. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the proposal itself, and that describes the action proposed or refused by the school. We also need to include an explanation of why the school proposes or refuses to take the action. This next part is essential, but often overlooked, and that is a description of each evaluation procedure, assessment, record, or report that the school used as a basis for their decision. You may also need to capture a description of other options that the IEP team considered and the reasons why those options were accepted or rejected. Additionally, you may also need to capture a description of other factors that were relevant to the proposal. So let's go ahead and look at how this actually plays out in an IEP. We're going to look at some prior written notice statements that could use a little help, and then we're going to fix them up. Our first proposal was written this way: SLP testing not needed. And the reason documented for accepting that proposal was the SLP said we didn't need to test. So remember, this is an example of a proposal that needs our help. What we need to think about is what is missing from this proposal and what would we change so that it can meet the standards of a proposal. On the screen and in your study guide are all the elements that you need to write a fantastic proposal. So go ahead and stop the video and take this proposal and see if you can't fix it up a little. Okay, we're back. So this proposal is probably part of a read. And it's great that they included it in the prior written notice, but the language could really use some rewording. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's look and see how we can improve on the proposal. So we could go ahead and change it to district proposes utilizing existing data in order to determine continuing eligibility at student X's triennial reevaluation. Let's now look at the reason or justification for accepting that proposal. So based on the data demonstrated in the read, it has sufficient data currently to determine eligibility at this time. The read contains data from the 3 previous progress monitoring, as well as data from the initial evaluation. The progress monitoring is extensive and does not indicate that exit is warranted at this time and provides information regarding present levels. Therefore, a more formal evaluation in the area of speech language is not needed at this time. Okay, let's look at another example of what not to do. This is proposal 2. So the proposal was documented as ESY/transportation. And the reason for accepting this proposal was that student X qualified for these services. So let's see what we can do to help this proposal. So what's missing from this proposal or added? And then how would you change it so that it would meet standards? Now would be a good time to pause the video so that we can work on the answer. Are you getting the hang of this? I bet you're doing great. Let's check out one way to fix it. First off, ESY and transportation are 2 different proposals that would need 2 different justifications. So let's break them up into 2 different proposals. So now we can say SFPS proposed ESY, extended school year, to address regression without recoupment in goal areas of reading and physical therapy. What we did here was that we were very specific about what we were proposing and why we were proposing to do it. Next, let's look at the reason or justification as to why we're going to accept that proposal. Due to regression without recoupment, as described in detail in the present levels of performance, the team determined that ESY was the better option at this time to address these deficits in reading and physical therapy. So what we did here is detail the report that we used, which was the present levels of performance, in order for us to make that determination. Of course, this verbiage wouldn't mean anything unless we actually had this data in the present levels. So let's make sure that we actually include it. We want to make sure that data is always driving our decisions, and that we are using that data and displaying that in the IEP so that we can make the decisions as a team. Okay, let's look at another proposal that needs a little help and see what we can do. Let's tackle our third proposal. So the proposal, as written, stated principal of blank school was in attendance, and the reason for inviting the principal seemed a bit of a mismatch. School's personnel explained in detail what the school's program looked like, to include the schedule for next year and what a regular day would look like for student X. After team discussion and explanation, parents are in agreement regarding student X's new placement. They feel that this setting will provide the structure and support student X needs to be more successful throughout student X's school day. Let's see if we can't help this proposal out. Go ahead and pause the video now to work on it. How did you do this time? I bet you're doing great. Let's check out another way. In Proposal 3, it looks like there may have been a disconnect between the proposal, having the principal attend the meeting, and the reason justification of having the principal attend. Principals are always welcome at the IEP meeting, and in many cases serve a vital role as the LEA representative. We don't need to PWN that the principal attended. Their attendance is recorded on the meeting participants sheet and on the invitation to the parent and the student. The reason or the justification seem to talk more about a change of placement. And it actually had many key pieces to justify a change of placement, and it's great that that was included in the IEP. What is also needed to capture is the data and report that the team discussed to make their determination, any other options or other relevant factors. I bet you're getting good at this now. Let's go ahead and try another proposal. For Proposal 4, the proposal is Student Z is on a career diploma. Anytime a student starts or changes a graduation pathway, it needs to be included. So the fact that it was is great. So let's look at the reason they accepted this proposal. The documentation that was included as the reason for accepting this proposal was the team agreed to the option. So now let's talk about what we can do to fix this and make it better. Now is a good time to pause your video. How did you do this time? Let's look at another example on how to fix it. The district, SFPS, proposes to change Student A's graduation pathway from standard to career to better address Student A's post-secondary needs. This proposal explains exactly what we want to do and why we want to do it. So next, we need to look at the reason or justification as to whether or not we are going to accept or reject this proposal. So let's go ahead and look at this reason. Based on transition assessments X and Y, present levels of performance, and a student interview, the team determined that the career pathway was the more appropriate pathway for graduation so that Student A could take advantage of district welding courses and substitute other previously required courses so that Student A could move towards career readiness when she leaves high school. What this reason did was provide the different information sources that the team used to make their decision, and then it explained why that was the best decision for the student at the time. So now, we are finished with some examples of the language that we need to use in order to have an appropriate prior written notice. We're going to move on to talking a little bit about translation. IDEA states that the prior written notice provided to parents shall be in a written language that is understandable to the general public and provided in the native language of the parent or other mode of communication used by the parent unless it's clearly not feasible to do so. However, if the native language or other mode of communication used by the parent is not a written language, the LEA shall take steps to ensure that the notice is translated orally or by other means at the parents in their native language or other mode of communication. The parents understand the content of the notice and that there is written evidence that the preceding two requirements have been met. TimeNet, the application that we use to create our IEPs, has the ability to translate. Since the point of a prior written notice is so that parents can be involved in their child's education, you need to actually translate every document for every family who would need this accommodation. So translation is not for every IEP, but for every family who would need this type of accommodation. Since we're speaking about translation, we want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free. We want parents to understand what is written in the IEP. If our PWNs are not clear and easy to understand, we could be depriving parents of that opportunity. The prior written notice serves as a vehicle of communication between the parent and the school. The last thing that we want to talk about today is where you can go for more help or information. The New Mexico State Technical Manual Guide to the IEP is an excellent source of information, as well as a legacy resource from NICHE and the U.S. Department of Education. Additionally, the PWN document in TyNet has some explanations. Your program support specialist is an excellent resource, as is the IEP TyNet specialist. And lastly, you can also look on the SFPS Special Education website. Thank you so much for watching this training video on prior written notice. I hope that you found it useful and that you have an absolutely fantastic day. You want to make sure that your IEPs are written jargon-free. You want to make sure that your IEPs are written jargon-free. You want to make sure that your IEPs are written jargon-free. You want to make sure that your IEPs are written jargon-free. You want to make sure that your IEPs are written jargon-free. We want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free. We want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free. We want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free. We want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free. We want to make sure that our IEPs are written jargon-free.